Once that thread has been neutralized, then you can start rendering aid to yourself. Going back to our scenario at the grocery store with our family, I've taken her around to the arm. Well, our first line of defense against bleeding out of the arms or legs is a tourniquet. For years, there's been this misconception that tourniquets are evil and this bad beast, and they're not. Okay? We actually have several years of documented studies saying that tourniquets are saving lives. Now, that information has come to us at a great expense, so keep that in the back of your mind. However, in our textbooks of EMT and paramedic school and even in medical school, they told us the first thing you do is if we're bleeding is direct pressure. Then you apply a pressure dressing. And if that doesn't work, then you're going to elevate the wound. And if that doesn't work, then you're going to do pressure points. And then finally, your last resort, if you've tried everything else, use a tourniquet. Well, why are we wasting our time on doing a bunch of things that may or may not work, but using a tourniquet? Oh, well, they tell us because those work. Okay, well, let's skip that. We don't have a lot of time for trial and error on the scene or at that site in the grocery store. So tourniquets are your first line defense against any bleeding of the arms and legs. Now let's talk about how do we actually put on this tourniquet. We've got the Soft T Wide here from Tactical Med Solutions, and if I've been shot in the arm or I have an injury in this arm, I simply grab hold of this black piece here, the base, the buckle, slide it up the arm, and try to get up as high as I can. The proper placement of a tourniquet is up as high as you possibly can, but never on a joint. I'm going to cinch up and take up as much of that slack as I possibly can. And the weight of my arm on the tourniquet in my armpit is actually helping me hold that in there and allowing to do that. Once I've taken up all that slack, I simply grab the windlass and start turning until all bleeding is controlled. Now that may be 1 spin, 2 spins, maybe 30. It depends on everybody's arm. Once you've controlled that bleeding, you simply put it in the anchor there in the anchoring device. And don't forget to date and time it. That's just as important. We can leave tourniquets on for up to 6 to 8 hours right now. So the medics and the doctors and nurses need to know how long that tourniquet's been on. That's applying it to our arm. Let's say we've got to apply it now to our leg. I'm going to reset the tourniquet. Now, preparing a tourniquet for deployment is very, very important. The way I like to do it, and I recommend, is actually we have a few pieces of the tourniquet. We have this tail end and the loop. Well, I want to make that loop almost as long as that tail end. So that way if I do ever have to apply it to my hand, or excuse me, apply it to my arm or my leg, the loop is wide enough but not overly too wide, taking up a lot of time on my arm. I also have the buckle. So once I've made that loop as long as the tail, I make sure that my windlass is in line and that locking mechanism is up out of the way. I'm simply going to fold it back onto itself as such, and I can fit that in whatever type of carrying device I've got. Now to apply the tourniquet to the leg, we can do one of two things. I can either open this loop up and shimmy it up my leg, or I can take the buckle and actually undo the buckle and then apply it up as high as I possibly can, never on a joint, and cinch it down and take up as much of that slack as possible. If I can, as a little pearl of wisdom, is to keep this windlass towards the inside or the midline of the body. That's going to help protect it later during transportation. But right now I'm going to cinch that up as tight as I can. And then again, start turning it until all the bleeding is controllable. It doesn't matter if it's bright red or if it's dark red, we need to control that bleeding. So turn it, put it in the locking mechanism, and of course, date and time it. The other way is to shimmy it up the leg. So again, I'm going to prep the tourniquet. Be sure and make that loop and that tail match up. Fix the windlass. Make sure the anchoring device is out of the way. And now I'm ready to deploy it. Say I just want to go up my leg with it. Well, I can do that. I may have to loosen this up, and it may take a little bit more time. Notice I have to lift my leg up. Get the windlass on the inside. Again, cinch it up as tight as I can. And then start turning until all bleeding is controllable. Locking in the locking mechanism, and then date and time it. That's just as important. Remember, they need to know how long that tourniquet's been on. Let's talk about placement. Why are we putting the tourniquet in certain positions or certain parts of the body? Well, for one thing, we've got, if you'll think about it, our upper arm here has got one bone. This part of the arm has two bones, and every body is developed and made up a little bit different than the next. So we've got one bone here, two bones here. Well, to make it simple for everybody to remember, well, we just place it up as high as we can. But anatomically, the reason why is the objective of the tourniquet is to actually occlude and restrict blood flow from going past those and through those arteries and veins. And the best way you can do that is compress it up against the bone, the muscle tissue, and also constrict the vein or artery itself. If we move it down farther, lower, we've got two bones to compete with. And technically, could a vein or artery, if we've got those two bones here, that vein or artery could get pushed and protected between those two bones, and when the tourniquet clamps down, it's not occluding it at all. So we need to put it up as high as we possibly can, but never on a joint. Your legs are very similar to your arms. Here we've got one bone, one solid bone. Here, your lower leg, we've got two bones. And the same thing can happen there. So that's why we apply it up as high as we possibly can. Those veins and arteries running through your legs and your arms, they're a lot larger up here. So again, we're getting more meat, if you will, and more arteries and surface area to cover up there. That's why we're putting the placement up as high as we possibly can. There are a lot of myths surrounding the tourniquet. And for years we've been told, and at the layperson's level all the way through healthcare professionals, that the tourniquets were a dangerous thing and they're our absolute last resort. And in our textbook it says, okay, direct pressure first. If that fails, then use a pressure dressing. If that fails, then you're going to apply pressure points. If that fails, then you're going to go to elevate the limb above the heart. And if you've tried everything else, go ahead and apply a tourniquet. Well, in these scenarios, you may not always have time for trial and error to figure out what's working and not. And I always ask, well, why are we doing tourniquet last? Oh, because it works. Well, why don't we bump that up a little bit? Over the years, there have been a lot of studies on tourniquets, and they are working and they are saving lives. Tourniquets can fail. 9 times out of 10, the most common reason that they're failing is because people are applying them too low in their arms and legs. They think they've got it up high enough, and they really don't. So be sure you get it up as high as possible on that arm or leg. A second reason is binding of the buckle. I've seen my students in classes, they get in a big hurry, and they start binding up that buckle. It doesn't take much for these buckles to bind up if you're not paying attention. So be sure you're training on utilizing that buckle. And then also, not taking up the slack. You've got to take up that slack when you're pulling that tail. If you don't take up the slack, your windlass, as you crank it up, is going to eat up all the slack instead of actually compressing and actually trying to occlude that vein or artery. So don't forget, your tourniquet is your first line defense against any bleeding out of the arms and legs. Also, the placement. Be sure you place it high up on the arms and legs as well. And tourniquets do save lives.